The kitchen hearth cast dancing shadows across Seraphina's dark skin as she moved with practiced silence through the pre-dawn darkness. Her calloused hands trembled, not from cold but from the weight of what she was about to do. The massive plantation house of Magnolia Grove loomed above her like a sleeping beast, its white columns gleaming pale in the moonlight that filtered through the kitchen's single window. 4:30 in the morning. Master Thaddeus Blackwood would wake in exactly 1 hour, demanding his breakfast with the same cruel impatience he demanded everything else. But this morning would be different. This morning, Seraphina would begin her grandmother's work, the work of blood and vengeance that had been whispered to her in dreams since the day they took her baby Moses away. She lit the oil lamp with shaking fingers, keeping the flame low. The kitchen came alive in the amber glow, cast iron pots hanging from hooks, wooden bowls stacked on rough-hewn shelves, and the great oak table where she had prepared thousands of meals for the man who owned her body, but would never own her soul, not anymore. From beneath her thin cotton dress, Seraphina withdrew a small vial made of dark glass, one of the few possessions she had managed to hide from the overseers. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, speaking in the old tongue that had traveled across oceans in the hearts of stolen people. Blood calls to blood, child. The ancestors remember. They hunger for justice. The monthly bleeding had come upon her yesterday, and she had carefully collected what she needed. In her grandmother's homeland, a place Seraphina had never seen but carried in her bones, such blood was sacred, powerful. It held the essence of creation and destruction, of life and death intertwined. Mixed with the right words, the proper intention, it could bind a soul to suffering, and Master Blackwood deserved to suffer. Seraphina's eyes burned with unshed tears as she remembered Moses's tiny fingers clutching at her dress, his desperate cries echoing through the slave quarters as Blackwood's men dragged him away to be sold. Only 8 months old and already condemned to a life of chains because his skin was too light, his parentage too obvious. The master couldn't bear the reminder of his own weakness, his own sin. He's property, Blackwood had said, not even looking at the child. Nothing more. But Moses had been everything to Seraphina. Her heart, her hope, her reason for enduring another day in hell. She began her work with methodical precision, just as her grandmother had taught her in stolen moments when the white folks weren't watching. First the coffee. Master Blackwood's pride and joy imported beans that cost more than most slaves earned in a year. She ground them by hand, the rhythmic motion helping to calm her racing pulse. Into the dark powder she added 3 drops from the vial, watching as they disappeared without a trace. "Emi mi, kosi o minirafano," she whispered in Yoruba, the words falling from her lips like a prayer and a curse combined. "By my blood there shall be no peace for you." The coffee began to brew, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. But underneath the familiar scent, Seraphina detected something else, something metallic and ancient like the smell of earth after rain. The spirits were listening. Next came the cornbread, Master Blackwood's other daily indulgence. She mixed the batter with practiced ease, her grandmother's voice guiding her movements. Into the yellow mixture went 2 more drops of blood, stirring clockwise as the old woman had taught her, always clockwise to bind the curse tight. "Ogun yo wasio, hyomu oninu egere," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Vengeance will come to you. It will take you in your sins." The words felt alive on her tongue, carrying power that made the air in the kitchen grow thick and heavy. The lamp flame flickered, though there was no breeze, and for a moment, Seraphina could swear she saw her grandmother's face in the dancing light. Proud, fierce, and filled with righteous anger. As she worked, memories crashed over her like waves. Moses's first smile, the way he would quiet when she sang to him, the softness of his hair against her cheek during the precious few hours each day when she was allowed to hold him, and then the morning when she woke to find his makeshift crib empty, the space where he had lain still warm with his body heat. "Where is he?" she screamed, running barefoot across the plantation grounds in her nightdress. "Where is my baby?" The answer had come from Ezekiel, the overseer, his whip coiled in his hand like a snake. "Master sold him to the Pemberton place downriver. You best get back to work and forget about him. Ain't your boy no more." But a mother doesn't forget. A mother's love transcends ownership, transcends the artificial boundaries drawn by men who mistake power for right. And a mother's rage, when properly channeled, could move mountains, or destroy them. The cornbread went into the brick oven, the heat washing over Seraphina's face like breath from the mouth of hell itself. She had always been careful around the oven before, afraid of burns that would mark her skin and reduce her value, but fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her value no longer mattered. Only justice mattered now. As the bread baked, she prepared the rest of Master Blackwood's morning meal. Salt pork fried in its own fat, the grease popping and sizzling. Eggs from the henhouse, their yolks golden as the sunrise that was still an hour away. Butter churned by her own hands just yesterday, before she had known that today would mark the beginning of the end. Into each dish, she added her essence. Not enough to taste, not enough to see, but enough to carry her pain, her rage, her desperate love for a child she would never hold again. The old magic flowed through her fingers, turning simple breakfast into something far more potent. Biobaja iwo yoja ironumi, she sang softly as she worked. As you eat, you will consume my sorrow. The kitchen grew colder despite the fire in the oven, and shadows began to move in ways that defied the steady lamp flame. Seraphina felt eyes upon her, not human eyes, but the gaze of those who had gone before, the countless souls who had suffered under masters like Blackwood, who had died with their pain unacknowledged and their lives unmourned. They were with her now. She could feel their presence like a weight on her shoulders, their whispered encouragement in languages both familiar and forgotten. Her grandmother stood closest, one weathered hand resting on Seraphina's shoulder as she had done so many times in life. "Do not fear, granddaughter," the spirit seemed to say. "The work is righteous. The ancestors approve." A floorboard creaked overhead. Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs as heavy footsteps moved across the ceiling. Master Blackwood's bedroom, directly above the kitchen. Too early. He was waking too early. The routine had been the same for 3 years. He rose at 5:30, demanded his breakfast at 6, and spent the morning reviewing the plantation books while eating. It was only 4:45. The footsteps paused, then resumed, pacing back and forth across the room. Seraphina forced herself to continue working, ladling the eggs onto a ceramic plate painted with blue flowers, a plate worth more than her life, according to the laws of Mississippi. Her hands remained steady despite her terror. The work was too important to fail now. More footsteps, heavier this time. He was moving toward the stairs. Seraphina quickly corked the vial and tucked it back beneath her dress, the glass warm against her skin. The cornbread was nearly done, its golden surface rising perfectly in the oven's heat. She pulled it out with iron tongs, setting it on the wooden cooling rack just as the stairs began to creak under Master Blackwood's weight. Step 2, 3. She arranged the food on his breakfast tray with the same care she had shown for 3 years, but now each movement carried deadly purpose. The coffee steamed in its china cup, black as sin and twice as bitter. The cornbread waited to be sliced, innocent-looking but infused with power older than the cotton fields, older than the plantation itself. 5 steps. 6. 7. Seraphina. His voice boomed through the house like thunder, making her jump despite her preparation. "Where's my breakfast, girl?" "Coming, master," she called back, her voice steady and servile as always. Inside, her soul burned with the fire of 1,000 suns, but her face showed nothing but the empty compliance of a well-trained slave. That mask had kept her alive for 26 years. It would serve her purpose now. 8 steps. 9. The kitchen door creaked open. Master Thaddeus Blackwood filled the doorway like a pillar of pale flesh and cruelty, his nightgown hanging loose around his considerable belly. His gray eyes swept the kitchen with the casual ownership of a man who had never doubted his right to possess other human beings. Those same eyes had watched without emotion as Moses was carried away, had dismissed Seraphina's tears as easily as swatting a fly. "About time," he grumbled, running thick fingers through his thinning hair. "Couldn't sleep. Kept hearing. Never mind. Just bring the food to my study, and make sure the coffee's strong. I've got a long day ahead." "Yes, master." Seraphina lifted the tray with both hands, the weight of it nothing compared to the burden of her hatred. "Right away, master." She followed him through the house, past portraits of long-dead Blackwoods who stared down from their gilded frames with the same cold eyes that had haunted her dreams. Their wealth had been built on bodies like hers, their comfort purchased with blood and suffering. But the ledger was about to be balanced. In his study, surrounded by leather-bound books he couldn't read and maps of lands he would never see, Master Blackwood settled into his chair with a grunt of satisfaction. Seraphina set the tray before him, her movements graceful and automatic. "That's all," he said without looking at her, already reaching for the coffee cup. "Send Cordelia down when she wakes. We need to discuss the Pemberton visit next week." The Pemberton plantation, where Moses had been sold, where her baby was learning to walk in chains, learning his first words from strangers, growing up without his mother's touch. Seraphina's jaw clenched involuntarily, but she kept her head bowed. "Yes, master." She turned to leave, but paused at the study door to watch as Thaddeus Blackwood raised the coffee cup to his lips and took his first sip. The liquid passed between his thin lips, carrying with it her pain, her power, and the promise of justice that had been brewing in her heart for months. He made a small sound of satisfaction, already reaching for a piece of cornbread. "Perfect as always, Seraphina. Whatever I'm paying you, it's not enough." The cruel irony of his words, talking about payment to a woman who earned nothing, owned nothing, was nothing in the eyes of the law, might have broken her spirit once. Now it only fueled the fire that burned in her belly. "Thank you, master," she said softly, her voice carrying layers of meaning he could never comprehend. As she walked back to the kitchen, Seraphina felt the change beginning, subtle as morning mist, inevitable as sunrise. The first binding had been cast. The curse had found its target. In the depths of her soul she heard her grandmother's approving whisper, and the distant cry of a child who would finally be avenged. The war for Moses's memory had begun, and Master Thaddeus Blackwood had just consumed his first taste of defeat. Behind her, she could hear him humming contentedly as he ate his poisoned feast, completely unaware that his world was about to crumble into blood and shadow. The morning sun was rising over Magnolia Grove, but for the master of the plantation, the darkness was just beginning to fall. If you're enjoying this dark tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below about what you think will happen next. 3 weeks had passed since Seraphina began her grandmother's work, and the changes were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Master Thaddeus Blackwood had developed what he called a refined palate, though the slaves whispered among themselves that it seemed more like an obsession. Every morning, he would lumber down to the kitchen before dawn, drawn by some inexplicable hunger that gnawed at his belly like a living thing. He no longer trusted anyone else to prepare his meals, not Delilah, who had cooked for the Blackwood family for 15 years, not even his wife Cordelia's personal servant Magnolia, whose biscuits had once been his particular weakness. "Only Seraphina knows how I like things," he would mutter, hovering near the kitchen door like a moth drawn to flame. "The rest of you can't seem to get the seasoning right." But it wasn't seasoning that kept him coming back. It was something deeper, something that called to the darkness growing in his soul like blood calling to blood. Each meal bound him tighter to Seraphina's will, though he remained blissfully unaware of the invisible chains being forged around his spirit. Seraphina moved through her daily tasks with a composure that unnerved the other slaves. Where once she had been quick to tears, jumping at every harsh word from the overseers, now she carried herself with an almost regal bearing. Her back stayed straight even under the heaviest loads, and her dark eyes held secrets that made grown men look away. "Something ain't right about that girl," Ezekiel Washington muttered to his wife as they watched Seraphina hang laundry in the yard. The overseer was a lean man with skin like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing, or so he believed. "Ever since the master sold her boy, she's been different." His wife, Sarah, glanced up from her mending with worried eyes. "Different how?" "Quiet, too quiet. And the way the master follows her around, asking for second helpings, third helpings." Ezekiel shook his head. "Ain't natural for a man of his station to be so concerned with the kitchen." What Ezekiel couldn't see were the dreams that plagued Master Blackwood's sleep. Visions that grew more vivid with each cursed meal. In them, he walked through endless fields of cotton under a blazing sun, his hands raw and bleeding from picking until his fingers were nothing but bone. He felt the bite of shackles around his ankles, the sting of the whip across his back, the desperate hunger that came from being given barely enough food to survive. In these dreams he was not Thaddeus Blackwood, master of Magnolia Grove. He was property, a thing to be bought and sold, worked until he dropped and then worked some more. He experienced the particular agony of watching his children torn from his arms, sold to distant plantations where he would never see them again. And always, in these nightmares, there was a woman watching, a woman with skin dark as midnight and eyes that held the accumulated pain of generations. She never spoke, but her presence filled him with a dread so profound that he would wake gasping, his nightgown soaked with sweat that smelled of fear and something else, something metallic and ancient. Just indigestion, he would tell himself, stumbling to his wash basin in the pre-dawn darkness. Too much rich food before bed. But even as he spoke the words, his stomach would begin to rumble with that peculiar hunger that only Seraphina's cooking could satisfy. He would find himself dressed and heading downstairs before he was fully awake, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name or resist. Cordelia Blackwood noticed the change in her husband, though she lacked the imagination to guess its true cause. She was a frail woman of 35 who looked 50, her blonde hair already streaking with premature gray and her blue eyes perpetually shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that came from living with a cruel man. Thaddeus has been eating like a field hand, she confided to her sister during one of their weekly visits. 3 full meals a day and he's still asking for more. It's unseemly. What she didn't mention was how he had begun talking in his sleep, speaking in voices that weren't his own, using words in languages she didn't recognize. Sometimes she would wake to find him staring at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes, his lips moving in what looked like prayer but sounded like pleading. "Please," he would whisper. "Please, I'll do anything. Don't take them away." When she asked him about it in the morning, he would claim no memory of the dreams, but she could see the fear lingering in his gray eyes like smoke after a fire. The other slaves on Magnolia Grove began to sense the change as well, though they understood it in ways the white folks never could. Ancient knowledge ran in their blood. Memories of homeland magic, of curses and blessings that traveled across oceans in the hearts of stolen people. They recognized the signs of spiritual work being done, even if they couldn't identify the practitioner, old Jeremiah, who tended the plantation's small infirmary and had delivered half the babies in the slave quarters, watched Seraphina with knowing eyes. He had been born in Virginia 70 years ago to a woman who remembered the old ways, and he could smell the scent of working magic like other men could smell rain coming. "Child's walking with the ancestors," he murmured to his assistant, a young woman named Delilah who ground herbs and mixed poultices under his guidance. Can see it in the way she moves, the way shadows fall differently around her. Delilah, who had been Seraphina's closest friend before Moses was born, felt torn between loyalty and fear. She had watched her friend's grief transform into something harder and more dangerous, and had seen the way Seraphina's laughter died the day they took her baby away. Now she worried about what might rise from the ashes of that sorrow. "She's grieving," Delilah said carefully. "Losing a child changes a woman." "Change her, yes," Jeremiah agreed, grinding dried roots with his mortar and pestle. "But this is more than grief. This is retribution. And retribution, once started, doesn't always know when to stop." In the big house, the effects of Seraphina's work were becoming impossible to ignore. Master Blackwood's appetite had grown beyond what his body could reasonably accommodate, yet he never seemed to gain weight. Instead, he appeared to be wasting away, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that should have been expanding with his increased consumption. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of sunlight seemed to improve, and dark circles had appeared under his eyes as if he hadn't slept properly in weeks, which in truth he hadn't. The dreams came every night now, growing more vivid and more terrible until he began to dread the very act of closing his eyes. "Send for Dr. Pemberton," Cordelia finally insisted after watching her husband consume an entire loaf of bread at breakfast and immediately ask for more. "Something's wrong with you, Thaddeus. This isn't natural." But when Dr. Pemberton arrived, the same man who had purchased baby Moses from Blackwood 3 weeks earlier, he could find nothing wrong with the plantation master. His pulse was strong, his breathing clear, his temperature normal. The doctor prescribed a tonic for indigestion and suggested that Blackwood might benefit from reducing his food intake. "Perhaps a fast would do you good," Dr. Pemberton suggested, packing his medical bag. "Clear out the system, restore the natural balance." The suggestion sent Blackwood into something approaching panic. The thought of going without food, specifically without Seraphina's food, filled him with a terror he couldn't explain. "No," he said quickly. "No, I need to keep my strength up. The plantation requires constant supervision." Dr. Pemberton left, shaking his head. muttering about the strange appetites that sometimes afflicted plantation owners in their later years. He had no idea that 3 miles down the river road, the infant he had purchased was thriving in the care of a wet nurse, growing stronger every day while his mother's curse grew stronger as well. The supernatural manifestations began on the 4th Tuesday of Seraphina's work. Master Blackwood was in his study, forcing down his 3rd helping of the evening meal, when he caught sight of movement in his peripheral vision. He turned his head sharply, expecting to see one of the house slaves, but found only empty air and dancing shadows. Yet the shadows were wrong somehow. They moved independently of their sources, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the steady lamplight. As he watched, transfixed with growing horror, one shadow detached itself entirely from the wall and began to take shape, the outline of a woman holding something small against her chest. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice cracking with strain. "Show yourself." But the shadow woman only stood there, swaying slightly as if rocking something to sleep. Then, with movements that seemed to mock his own earlier actions, she turned and walked away, fading into the darkness beyond the lamplight's reach. Blackwood's hands trembled as he reached for his wine glass, draining it in one desperate gulp. The rich Bordeaux tasted like ashes in his mouth, and for a moment he could swear he heard the faint sound of a baby crying somewhere in the house. "Cordelia," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the plantation house. "Cordelia, get in here." His wife appeared in the doorway moments later, her face pale with concern. "What is it, Thaddeus? What's wrong? Did you hear that crying?" She tilted her head, listening to the silence that surrounded them. "I don't hear anything. There was a baby crying. Somewhere upstairs, I think." He pushed back from his desk, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "One of the house girls must have brought their child inside. You know I don't allow that." But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. There were no babies in the slave quarters. Hadn't been born for months, not since Moses. And the crying he had heard carried a particular quality of loss and longing that made his chest tight with inexplicable guilt. Cordelia approached his desk cautiously, as if he were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Thaddeus, you look terrible." "Perhaps you should rest." "I'm fine," he snapped, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The truth was, he felt anything but fine. His body ached constantly now, as if he had been doing hard physical labor all day. His back hurt with a persistent pain that no amount of rest could relieve. And his hands had developed calluses that appeared overnight, rough patches that looked exactly like the hands of a field worker. As the weeks progressed, the changes in Master Blackwood became impossible to hide. His usually immaculate appearance grew disheveled, his hair unwashed and his clothes wrinkled. He would disappear for hours at a time, only to be found wandering the cotton fields in his nightgown, staring at the plants with an expression of desperate recognition. "It's like he's remembering something," Magnolia observed to the other house slaves as they watched him through the kitchen window. The elderly woman had served the Blackwood family for 40 years, and she had never seen the master behave so strangely. "Something that scares him down to his bones." Seraphina said nothing, but her dark eyes followed Master Blackwood's stumbling figure with satisfaction. The curse was taking hold exactly as her grandmother had promised it would. Each meal drew him deeper into the collective memory of suffering, each bite binding his consciousness more tightly to the experience of those he had oppressed. Soon, he would understand what it truly meant to be property. Soon he would feel in his own flesh the pain he had inflicted on others, and when that understanding was complete, when he had experienced every moment of agony that his cruelty had caused, then perhaps Moses would finally be avenged. But first, the master needed to eat. And Seraphina had prepared something special for his dinner. Cornbread mixed with tears she had shed over her lost child, seasoned with herbs that carried the weight of ancestral knowledge, and blessed with words that had never been spoken in this land before but had traveled across oceans in the hearts of the enslaved. She rang the dinner bell, and like a man walking to his own execution, Master Thaddeus Blackwood began his slow journey toward the dining room. Drawn by hunger, he could no longer control toward a feast that would damn his soul. The shadows in the corners of the plantation house seemed to pulse with anticipation, and somewhere in the darkness, the spirits of the dead whispered their approval of the justice finally being served. The blood moon hung low over Magnolia Grove like a crimson eye watching the sins of the earth below. October had arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the plantation house, and with it came a darkness that had nothing to do with the shortening days. Master Thaddeus Blackwood stood at his bedroom window, staring up at the bloated lunar orb with eyes that no longer held any trace of their former arrogance. 6 weeks of Seraphina's cursed meals had transformed him from a robust man of 50 into something that barely resembled a human. His once proud bearing had collapsed into a perpetual stoop, as if he carried invisible chains across his shoulders. His skin had taken on the grayish pallor of old parchment, and when he moved it was with the shuffling gait of a man 3 times his age. But it was his eyes that told the true story of his torment. Where once they had been cold and calculating, now they burned with a fevered intensity that spoke of terrible visions and sleepless nights. Dark circles surrounded them like bruises, and they darted constantly to the shadows, as if expecting something dreadful to emerge from the darkness at any moment. "The moon," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the October wind that rattled the windows. "It's watching me. They're all watching me." Behind him, Cordelia stirred in their 4-poster bed, her pale face creased with worry. She had taken to sleeping with laudanum these past weeks, the only way she could find peace in a house that seemed to throb with malevolent energy. Even drugged, she could feel the wrongness that had settled over their home like a burial shroud. "Thaddeus," she called softly, "come away from the window. You need to rest." But rest was a luxury he could no longer afford. The dreams that came with sleep had grown so vivid, so unbearably real, that he often couldn't tell where the nightmare ended and waking life began. In them he was not the master but the master, a piece of property to be worked until he broke, beaten until he bled, sold whenever it suited his owner's convenience. He had experienced birth in slave quarters, the first breath drawn in bondage. He had felt the desperate love of mothers for children they could never truly protect. He had known the particular agony of the auction block, standing naked while white men examined his teeth and muscles like those of a prize horse, and always he felt the crushing weight of powerlessness that came with being considered less than human. "I can't," he said, his breath fogging the cold window glass. "They won't let me rest. Not until what?" Cordelia pushed herself up on her elbows, her blonde hair hanging in limp strands around her face. The laudanum made her movement sluggish, but even through the drug-induced haze, she could see that her husband was disappearing before her eyes, becoming something she no longer recognized. Blackwood turned from the window, and in the moonlight, Cordelia gasped. For just a moment, his face seemed to shift and change, becoming darker, more angular. The features that had once been aristocratic and refined took on the harsh planes of someone who had known hard labor and harder times. When he spoke, his voice carried accents that didn't belong to a Mississippi plantation owner. "Not until I pay," he said, and the words seemed to come from someone else entirely. "Not until every debt is settled, every tear accounted for, every drop of blood repaid in kind." Then he blinked and he was Thaddeus Blackwood again, or what was left of him. But Cordelia had seen enough to know that whatever was happening to her husband was far beyond the reach of any doctor or medicine. This was something older, something that spoke to sins that ran deeper than flesh and bone. In the kitchen below, Seraphina worked by the light of the blood moon, preparing the morning meal that would continue her relentless work. The red light streaming through the window cast everything in shades of crimson and shadow, making the familiar space look like something from a nightmare. But to Seraphina it was beautiful, the moon of her ancestors, the celestial witness to justice finally being served. She had added new elements to her ritual over the past weeks, ingredients that her grandmother's spirit had whispered to her in dreams. Graveyard dirt from the slave cemetery, taken from the fresh grave of old Samuel who had died from overwork the previous month. Water collected during thunderstorms when the ancestors' voices rode the lightning, and most powerfully, soil from the place where her umbilical cord had been buried when she was born, earth that held the essence of her connection to this land that had never truly been hers to love. "The moon grows fat with blood. Tonight," she murmured in Yoruba as she worked, her hands moving with practiced precision, "and the spirits grow strong." As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the kitchen dropped noticeably. The oil lamp flickered, and in its dancing light shapes began to move, forms that had no earthly origin. They were slaves who had died on Magnolia Grove over the decades, their spirits drawn back by the promise of retribution. There was Rebecca, who had been working to death in the cotton fields while pregnant with her third child. Marcus, who had been beaten so severely for trying to escape that he never walked again. Little Sarah, only 12 years old when she died from the consumption that came from sleeping in the cold. Damp slave quarters with nothing but rags for warmth. One by one, they materialized in the kitchen, their forms translucent but growing more solid as the blood moon reached its zenith. They made no sound, but their presence filled the room with the accumulated weight of their suffering. And at their center stood an elderly woman with kind eyes and hands that had known both healing and harm, Seraphina's grandmother, Iya Ugba. "The work progresses well, granddaughter," the old spirit said, her voice carrying across worlds to reach Seraphina's ears. "The master tastes our pain with every bite, feels our sorrow with every swallow. But the moon blood brings power. Tonight we show him the full weight of what he has done." Seraphina nodded, understanding. This was the night when the curse would deepen, when Master Blackwood would begin to experience not just individual suffering, but the collective trauma of every slave who had ever lived and died under his dominion. The blood moon amplified spiritual work, made the boundaries between worlds thin as gossamer. Tonight the dead could speak with voices that even the living would have to hear. As she prepared the familiar meal, coffee, cornbread, eggs, and salt pork, Seraphina added something new. From a small pouch hidden in her dress, she withdrew a fragment of bone, yellowed with age and worn smooth by countless hands. It had belonged to her great-grandmother, the woman who had survived the Middle Passage and taught the first generation of American-born slaves how to keep their spiritual traditions alive in a hostile land. She ground the bone to powder with a mortar and pestle that had belonged to the plantation's previous cook, a woman named Celia, who had died mysteriously in her sleep after refusing to prepare food for a slave-beating celebration. Into Master Blackwood's coffee the powder went, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom and pain of generations. "Bogbo awan tiokuni yiorioni alae," Seraphina whispered, the words seeming to echo with the voices of the dead. "All those who have died will see you in your dreams." The kitchen exploded with spiritual energy as the incantation was completed. The lamp flame shot up toward the ceiling, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life. The very walls seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the tormented, and the air grew thick with the scent of blood and earth and ancient sorrow. But the manifestation was not confined to the kitchen. Throughout Magnolia Grove, the supernatural activity intensified as the blood moon reached its peak. In the slave quarters, families huddled together as they heard the voices of lost loved ones calling their names from the darkness beyond their doors. Children cried out in the night, claiming to see figures of deceased relatives standing at the foot of their beds, gesturing for them to come closer. Ezekiel Washington woke to find his cabin filled with an impossible chill and the sound of chains dragging across the wooden floor. When he lit a candle, he saw nothing, but the sound continued, measured, deliberate, the rhythm of feet that had walked too many miles in bondage. His wife Sarah pressed closer to him, her teeth chattering from more than cold. "Something's coming," she whispered. "Can you feel it?" "Something's coming for all of us." But it was in the big house that the spiritual storm struck with greatest force. As Master Blackwood finally forced himself away from the window and toward his bed, the very air around him began to shimmer and change. The familiar walls of his bedroom dissolved, replaced by the cramped interior of a slave cabin. The fine carpet beneath his feet became packed dirt. The silk curtains transformed into rough sacking that barely covered glassless windows, and he was no longer alone. They stood around him in the small space, dozens of figures in the rough clothing of field hands and house slaves, their dark skin bearing the scars of whips and hard labor. Men, women, children, all of them staring at him with eyes that held decades of accumulated pain. He recognized some of them. Slaves he had owned, slaves he had sold, slaves who had died under his care or lack thereof. "No," he whispered, backing against the wall of the phantom cabin. "This isn't real. This is just another dream." But it felt real. The dirt floor was cold beneath his bare feet. The air smelled of sweat and fear, and unwashed bodies crowded too closely together, and the eyes of the dead never left his face, boring into him with an intensity that made his soul writhe in recognition of its guilt. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, young, beautiful despite the exhaustion etched into her features, carrying something small wrapped in a tattered blanket. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of every mother who had ever lost a child to the cruelties of bondage. "You know me," she said simply. And he did. It was Seraphina, but not as she appeared in his waking life. This was Seraphina, as she had been before grief and loss had hardened her heart, full of hope and love and desperate faith that somehow, some way she might be able to protect her child from the horrors of their world. "I know you," he admitted, his voice breaking. I am every mother whose child you stole," she continued, and now her voice was joined by others, a chorus of feminine pain that seemed to echo from the very walls. "Every woman who begged you for mercy and found none. Every soul who prayed that you might see our humanity and chose blindness instead." The bundle in her arms began to stir, and Blackwood felt his heart stop. Tiny fingers emerged from the blanket, grasping at air with the desperate need of new life seeking comfort. A baby's cry filled the cabin, not the angry wail of hunger or discomfort, but the heartbroken sob of a child who knows, even in infancy, that the world holds no safety for him. "Moses," Blackwood whispered, the name torn from his lips like a confession. "My baby," Seraphina said, and her voice now carried all the weight of a mother's love and a mother's rage. "My beautiful boy that you sold like livestock. Do you remember what you said when I begged you to let me keep him?" Blackwood did remember. The words came back to him now with crystal clarity, each syllable sharp enough to cut. "He's property, nothing more. You'll forget about him soon enough. Your kind always does. Your kind." As if love were something that could be rationed by race. As if the bonds between mother and child could be severed as easily as a bill of sale. As if the enslaved were somehow less human in their capacity for feeling, less deserving of the basic dignities that he took for granted. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The words felt foreign on his tongue, an acknowledgement of fault that he had never been forced to make before. "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." "No," Seraphina said, her dark eyes blazing with righteous fury. "You understood perfectly. You simply chose not to care, and now you will learn what it means to lose everything you love, to have your heart torn from your chest and sold to strangers. Now you will know our pain as your own." The cabin began to spin around him, and Blackwood felt himself falling, not through space but through time. He experienced a dozen lives, 100 moments of loss and separation. He was a father watching his son dragged away in chains, a mother whose daughter was sold to pay gambling debts, a husband whose wife was taken by the master for his pleasure and never seen again. Each experience layered upon the others, building into a symphony of suffering that threatened to shatter his sanity entirely. He felt his heart break over and over, each loss cutting deeper than the last, until he understood that this was what Seraphina had endured every single day since Moses was taken from her arms. When the visions finally ended, he found himself back in his own bedroom, collapsed on the floor beside his bed. But the elegant furnishings now seemed obscene in their luxury, purchased with the currency of human misery. The blood moon still shone through his window, bathing everything in its crimson light, and he could swear he heard the echo of a baby's cry carried on the October wind. Cordelia was sitting up in bed, staring at him with undisguised horror. "Thaddeus, what happened?" "You were screaming, and the room was so cold I could see my breath." He struggled to his feet, his legs shaking like those of an old man. In the mirror across the room, his reflection looked haggard beyond his years, marked by experiences that belonged to lives he had never lived but now remembered as clearly as his own childhood. "I need food," he said, though his stomach churned at the thought. The compulsion that drove him to Seraphina's cooking had grown stronger, more desperate. It was no longer mere hunger that called him to the kitchen. It was the terrible need to complete whatever transformation had begun in his soul. "I need to eat." As he stumbled from the bedroom, leaving his terrified wife behind, Magnolia Grove itself seemed to pulse with supernatural energy. The walls groaned as if under tremendous pressure. Windows rattled in their frames despite the still night air. And in the slave quarters, old Jeremiah sat up in his narrow bed and spoke words that would prove prophetic. "The blood moon has spoken," he whispered to the darkness. "Justice comes with the dawn, and mercy has fled before it like shadows before the sun." In the kitchen, Seraphina waited with Master Blackwood's breakfast already prepared. The blood moon cast her shadow long across the floor, but in its red light she no longer looked like a slave. She looked like what she had always been, but had been forbidden to become. a queen in her own right, a wielder of ancient powers, a mother whose love could move heaven and earth to protect her child. The curse had reached its crescendo, and there would be no turning back now. The blood moon had witnessed her oath, and the ancestors had accepted her offering. Master Thaddeus Blackwood would continue to eat until he had consumed every drop of pain he had caused, and only then would little Moses finally be free. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and comment your thoughts. This story is about to get much darker. Dr. Jeremiah Pemberton arrived at Magnolia Grove on a gray November morning, his black medical bag clutched in hands that trembled with more than the seasonal cold. The plantation that had once been the jewel of the Mississippi Delta now appeared cursed by some malevolent blight. The famous magnolia trees that gave the estate its name stood bare and twisted, their branches reaching toward the leaden sky like arthritic fingers. Even the cotton fields, which should have been white with the final harvest, lay barren and brown, as if the very earth had turned poisonous. But it was the big house itself that truly unnerved the doctor. The white columns that had once gleamed like marble were now stained with what looked suspiciously like rust, or blood. The windows stared out like dead eyes, their glass reflecting nothing but darkness even in the pale daylight. And from somewhere within the structure came sounds that had no earthly origin. Scraping, dragging, the distant echo of chains. Lord preserve us, Dr. Pemberton muttered as he climbed the front steps, each footfall echoing hollowly in the unnatural stillness. What has become of this place? Cordelia Blackwood met him at the door, and the doctor barely recognized the woman who had once been considered one of the county's great beauties. Her blonde hair hung in unwashed strings around a face that had aged years in the span of months. Her blue eyes, once bright with the confidence of privilege, now darted constantly to the shadows as if expecting something terrible to emerge. "Doctor, thank God you've come," she whispered, ushering him quickly inside. "It's Thaddeus. He's not himself anymore." That was an understatement of catastrophic proportions. As Dr. Pemberton followed Cordelia through halls that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, he could see the evidence of supernatural decay everywhere. Family portraits hung askew on the walls, their painted eyes seeming to track his movement. The fine carpets were stained with substances he preferred not to identify, and the very air felt thick and oppressive as if the house itself were holding its breath. "When did this begin?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The timing would coincide with his own visit to the plantation, when he had purchased the infant Moses for his own estate. The thought made his stomach clench with unexpected guilt. Weeks ago, maybe longer. Cordelia wrung her hands as she spoke, the gesture reminiscent of the enslaved women Dr. Pemberton had seen pleading for mercy. "He eats constantly, but only food prepared by that. By Seraphina. He won't touch anything else." "And the dreams, doctor?" "The terrible dreams." They paused outside the master bedroom, and Dr. Pemberton could hear voices from within. Not one voice, but many, speaking in languages he didn't recognize and tones that made his skin crawl. Underneath it all was another sound, the rhythmic scraping of metal on wood as if someone were dragging chains across the floor. "He talks to them," Cordelia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The slaves. Dead ones, living ones, I can't tell the difference anymore. Sometimes I find him in the fields at dawn, kneeling in the dirt, begging forgiveness from empty air." Dr. Pemberton steeled himself and opened the bedroom door. The sight that greeted him defied every principle of medical science he had ever learned. Master Thaddeus Blackwood sat on the edge of his bed, but he was no longer the robust plantation owner who had sold him a baby 8 weeks earlier. This creature was gaunt to the point of emaciation, his skin hanging loose on bones that seemed too prominent beneath the flesh. His gray hair had turned completely white, and his eyes burned with a fevered intensity that spoke of visions no sane man should endure. But it was his hands that truly shocked the doctor. Blackwood's palms were covered with calluses thick as leather, the fingers scarred and twisted from labor that his body had never performed. His back was bent as if he had spent decades picking cotton under a merciless sun, and when he moved, it was with the careful gait of a man whose flesh remembered the bite of the whip. "Master Blackwood?" Dr. Pemberton approached cautiously, as he might approach a rabid animal. "I'm here to help you." Blackwood looked up, and for a moment his eyes seemed to clear. "Pemberton? Yes, I remember you. You took..." His voice trailed off and his gaze became distant again. They won't let me forget. Every night they show me. Every meal I taste their tears. Who, Thaddeus? Who won't let you forget? The dead. Blackwood's voice dropped to a whisper so low the doctor had to strain to hear it. They're all here, every slave who ever suffered on this land. They speak to me in languages I've never learned but somehow understand. They show me their memories, make me live their pain. As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the room plummeted. Dr. Pemberton's breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the windows despite the November warmth outside. In the corners of the room, shadows began to move with deliberate purpose, taking on shapes that resembled human forms. Do you see them? Blackwood asked, pointing at nothing Dr. Pemberton could observe. Rebecca is there by the window. She died in childbirth because you wouldn't let her rest. And Marcus beside the door. Remember Marcus? You had him whipped to death for stealing bread to feed his children. The doctor saw nothing, but he felt their presence like a weight on his soul. The air grew thick with accusation, and suddenly he found himself thinking of every cruel order he had given, every moment when he had chosen profit over human dignity. The baby Moses taken from his mother's arms and sold like livestock. The families he had separated. The lives he had destroyed in service of his own comfort. This is madness, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Something was happening in this room that went beyond the realm of medicine, something that spoke to sins that ran deeper than flesh and bone. Blackwood suddenly lurched to his feet with unnatural energy. Time for breakfast, he announced, his voice taking on a different cadence, younger, more desperate. Seraphina's waiting. She always waits for me now. Her food is the only thing that tastes real anymore. As they made their way downstairs, Dr. Pemberton noticed that the other inhabitants of the plantation house seemed to be affected by the same malaise that had consumed their master. The house slaves moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes vacant and their movements mechanical. When they spoke, it was in whispers, as if afraid that raising their voices might summon something better left undisturbed. Only Magnolia, the elderly woman who had served the Blackwood family for 40 years, seemed to retain any semblance of her former self. She pulled Dr. Pemberton aside as they passed through the parlor, her rheumy eyes bright with knowledge that came from sources older than medical textbooks. Doctor, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too much to be easily frightened. That girl Seraphina is walking with the ancestors. I can smell the magic on her, thick as honey and twice as dangerous. Magic? Dr. Pemberton scoffed, though his skepticism felt forced even to his own ears. Magnolia, surely you don't believe in such superstitions. The old woman's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Superstition? As a child, I was born on this plantation 70 years ago to a woman who remembered the homeland. I know working magic when I see it, and that girl is deep in the old ways. She's called up powers that don't forgive and don't forget. Before the doctor could respond, a piercing scream echoed from the kitchen. They rushed toward the sound, finding Delilah, one of the house slaves, backed against the wall with her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. She was staring at the large wooden table where Seraphina prepared the meals. But the table was no longer empty. Arranged across its surface were dozens of small objects that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Dr. Pemberton recognized some of them. Fragments of bone yellowed with age, dried herbs tied with hair, small dolls made from corn husks and cotton. But it was the centerpiece that made his blood run cold. A crude clay figure that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Master Blackwood, pierced through with rusty nails and surrounded by what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Seraphina's altar, Delilah whispered, her voice shaking with fear. I came in to start the morning bread and found this. She's been working root magic, Doctor. Strong magic, the kind that calls up the dead and binds the living to suffering. Dr. Pemberton approached the table with the fascination of a scientist observing a new species. He had heard stories of such practices among the enslaved population, remnants of African traditions mixed with Native American knowledge and Christian symbolism. But he had always dismissed them as ignorant superstition, the desperate fantasies of people with no real power. Now, faced with the evidence of Seraphina's work, he began to understand that he had been catastrophically wrong. This was not superstition but science of a different kind, older than European medicine, rooted in understandings of the human spirit that his training had never acknowledged. Where is she? He demanded. Where is Seraphina? But even as he spoke, he heard her voice drifting from the pantry, soft, melodic, speaking in the same African language that Master Blackwood had been babbling upstairs. She emerged a moment later, carrying a tray laden with food, and Dr. Pemberton gasped at the transformation that had overtaken her. The broken woman who had sobbed over her stolen child was gone. In her place stood someone regal, powerful, her dark skin seeming to glow with inner light. Her eyes held depths that spoke of ancient knowledge, and when she moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of achieving. "Dr. Pemberton," she said, her voice carrying layers of meaning that made him shiver. "How good of you to visit. I trust Moses well?" The casual mention of the baby hit him like a physical blow. Here was the mother of the child he had purchased, the woman whose heart he had helped to break. And she spoke of it with the calm assurance of someone who held all the power in the relationship. "Seraphina," he began, but she held up one hand to silence him. "I know why you're here," she continued, setting the tray on a side table with deliberate care. "You want to cure the master of his affliction? You think his suffering is a disease that can be treated with your medicines and your bloodletting?" She moved closer, and Dr. Pemberton found himself unable to retreat. Her presence filled the kitchen like smoke, and he could smell the scent of working magic, earth and blood and something older than memory. "But this is not sickness, doctor. This is justice. Every bite the master takes brings him closer to understanding what he has done. Every meal I prepare carries the pain of every mother who has lost her child, every father who has watched his family sold away, every soul who has died in bondage on this cursed soil." "This is madness," Dr. Pemberton protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're poisoning him. I am feeding him truth." Seraphina's eyes blazed with righteous fury. "For years, decades, he has consumed our labor, our pain, our very lives without ever tasting the bitterness of what he devoured. Now he will know the flavor of every tear he has caused to be shed." As if summoned by her words, Master Blackwood appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the irresistible compulsion that had controlled him for weeks. His appearance was even more shocking in the bright kitchen light, a walking skeleton wrapped in loose skin, his eyes burning with visions that no human mind should contain. "Seraphina," he said, his voice carrying the desperate need of an addict. "Please, I need to eat." She nodded with the satisfaction of a queen granting an audience to a subject. "Of course, master. I have prepared your favorite, cornbread with honey, coffee black as midnight, eggs fried in the fat of the pig you loved so much." But as she served him, Dr. Pemberton noticed something that made his medical training rebel in horror. The food on the plate was moving, not with the writhing of worms or insects, but with a life of its own. The cornbread pulsed like a beating heart, the coffee swirled in patterns that resembled faces in agony, and the eggs wept tears of blood that stained the white porcelain. Yet Master Blackwood ate without hesitation, devouring every morsel as if it were the finest delicacy. With each bite, his body seemed to grow more transparent, as if he were slowly fading from the world of the living into something else entirely. "Stop him," Dr. Pemberton said, turning to the other slaves who had gathered to watch. "Can't you see what she's doing to him?" But Delilah only shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and satisfaction. "He's eating his sins, doctor. Every cruelty he ever committed, every moment of pain he ever caused. She's making him taste what we have tasted all our lives." As Master Blackwood finished his meal, his transformation accelerated. His skin took on the dusky hue of someone who had spent years laboring under the sun. His hands, already calloused from phantom work, began to show the specific scars that came from picking cotton and hauling heavy loads. When he stood, it was with the careful movement of someone whose back had been broken by a lifetime of bending to another's will. "I remember," he whispered, his voice now carrying the accent of the field hands. "I remember being born in a cabin with dirt floors. I remember my mama being sold when I was 5 years old. I remember the first time I felt the whip across my back." These were not his memories, Dr. Pemberton realized with growing horror. These were the collective experiences of every enslaved person who had ever lived on Magnolia Grove. And somehow, Seraphina was forcing him to live through them all. "How?" the doctor asked, his voice barely audible. "How is this possible?" Seraphina turned to him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. "Blood calls to blood, doctor. Pain calls to pain. The ancestors do not forget, and they do not forgive. My grandmother taught me the old ways before she died, and her grandmother taught her. This knowledge has been passed down through generations of women who understood that sometimes justice must be taken rather than given. She gestured toward Master Blackwood, who was now swaying on his feet as if overwhelmed by the weight of experiences that belonged to dozens of different lives. He will continue to eat until he has consumed every moment of suffering he has caused. And when he has finally tasted the last tear, felt the last blow, endured the last separation, then perhaps Moses will finally be free. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft sobbing of Master Blackwood as he lived through memories that were not his own but were becoming more real to him than his own past. Dr. Pemberton watched in fascination, and horror as justice older than law and more powerful than medicine played out before his eyes. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Magnolia Grove, and the first drops of rain began to fall like tears from heaven itself. The curse had reached its full power now, and there would be no turning back. The binding that held Master Blackwood to his victim's experiences had tightened beyond any hope of release, and all that remained was to see how far into the abyss of suffering one man's soul could descend before it shattered entirely. In the distance, carried by the wind that preceded the storm, Dr. Pemberton could swear he heard the sound of a baby crying, not the angry wail of hunger or discomfort, but the heartbroken sob of a child calling for his mother across an impossible distance. Moses, somewhere down the river, reaching across the miles for the woman who had never stopped fighting for him. The reckoning was at hand, and mercy had no place at this table. The storm that had been building over Magnolia Grove for days finally broke on the night of November 15th, unleashing fury that seemed to come from the very bowels of hell itself. Lightning split the darkness with veins of silver fire, illuminating the plantation in stark, terrifying glimpses. Thunder rolled across the delta like the voice of an angry god, shaking the big house to its foundations and rattling windows that had somehow remained intact despite the supernatural forces tearing at the property's soul. In the master bedroom, Thaddeus Blackwood no longer resembled the man who had once ruled this domain with iron will and callous cruelty. The transformation that had begun with Seraphina's cursed meals had accelerated beyond all recognition. His body had withered to the point where his clothes hung on him like burial shrouds, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor of someone who had spent years laboring under a merciless sun. But it was his eyes that told the true story of his torment, windows into a soul that now contained the accumulated suffering of every slave who had ever lived and died on Magnolia Grove. He sat huddled in the corner of his room, no longer able to bear the softness of his feather mattress or the luxury of silk sheets. The floor felt more appropriate somehow, more honest. His hands, now permanently scarred with the calluses of phantom labor, clutched at his nightgown as visions cascaded through his consciousness like a river of pain. "Sarah," he whispered to the empty air, speaking to a slave girl who had died 30 years before he was born. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I tried to stop them from taking your baby, but Master Williams wouldn't listen. I tried." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies. He was not the field hand whose memories he now carried. He was the master who had created the conditions that made such suffering inevitable. Yet the boundaries between self and other had blurred beyond recognition, leaving him trapped in a labyrinth of experiences that belonged to dozens of different souls. Cordelia had long since fled to her sister's house in Natchez, unable to bear the sight of what her husband had become. She had packed her belongings in the dead of night, leaving behind a note that simply read, "God forgive us all for what we have done." The house slaves whispered that she had been seen boarding the riverboat with tears streaming down her face, clutching a small portrait of the man Thaddeus had been before the curse took hold. Now only the slaves remained to witness the final act of this supernatural drama, and they gathered in the main house like mourners at a wake, or spectators at an execution. Old Jeremiah moved through the rooms with his medical bag, but he carried it more from habit than hope. No earthly medicine could cure what afflicted Master Blackwood now. "The spirits are restless tonight," Magnolia observed, her weathered hands folded over her apron as she watched lightning illuminate the parlor in stark relief. "Can feel them pressing close, waiting for something. Something final." In the kitchen, Seraphina worked with the focused intensity of a high priestess preparing for the most sacred of rituals. Her movements had taken on an otherworldly grace, and when she spoke, it was often in voices that belonged to the dead. Her grandmother, her great-grandmother, ancestors stretching back to the homeland across the ocean. The blood moon had passed, but its power lingered in her bones, and tonight would see the culmination of everything she had begun. The meal she prepared was unlike any other she had created during her months of supernatural work. This was not mere food, but communion, a final sacrament that would complete the binding between master and slave, oppressor and oppressed. Into the cornbread went earth from every grave in the slave cemetery. The coffee was brewed with water drawn from the well where Rebecca had thrown herself, rather than watch another child sold away. The eggs came from hens that had been fed on grain, mixed with the ashes of the slave quarters that had burned down 20 years earlier, taking 12 souls with it. But the centerpiece of this Last Supper was something far more precious and terrible. From a vial she had hidden since the day Moses was taken, Seraphina withdrew the last drops of her breast milk that had been meant to nourish her son, but had instead turned bitter with grief and rage. This she mixed into honey that had been blessed by every mother who had ever lost a child to the institution of slavery. As she worked, the kitchen filled with presences that were no longer merely spiritual, but had taken on substance and weight. The dead walked among the living tonight, their forms growing more solid with each passing moment. They lined the walls like a jury assembled to witness final judgment, their eyes fixed on the woman who had become their instrument of justice. "The time has come, daughter," said a voice that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves. It was Iya Agba, Seraphina's grandmother, but her spirit now carried the authority of every ancestor who had ever suffered under the yoke of bondage. "The Master has tasted our pain, felt our sorrow, known our desperation. Tonight, he will understand the full weight of what he has wrought." Seraphina nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the lightning that continued to split the sky outside. "He will know justice, grandmother. Moses will be avenged." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Master Blackwood's approach, drawn by the same inexorable compulsion that had controlled him for months. But tonight was different. Tonight, he moved with the shambling gait of a man walking to his own execution, his face bearing the resigned expression of someone who finally understood that there could be no escape from the consequences of his actions. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, even the assembled spirits seemed to recoil from what he had become. This was no longer Thaddeus Blackwood, master of Magnolia Grove, but something else entirely. A vessel filled with the accumulated trauma of generations, a living monument to the horrors of human bondage. "Seraphina," he said, his voice now carrying the accents of a dozen different regions, the speech patterns of men and women who had been torn from their families and transported to this cursed soil. "I know why you've done this. I understand now." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Do you, Master? Do you truly understand? I feel them all," he whispered, his scarred hands reaching toward the tray she had prepared. "Every slave who ever lived on this land? Their memories are mine now. Their pain is mine. I know what it means to watch your children sold like livestock. I know what it means to work until your hands bleed and your back breaks. I know what it means to be considered less than human." As he spoke, his form seemed to flicker and change, becoming translucent so that the spirits behind him were visible through his flesh. He was becoming one of them, Seraphina realized, no longer fully alive but not yet fully dead, caught between worlds like so many of his victims had been caught between freedom and bondage. "And still you come to me for food," she observed, her voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Still you hunger for what I offer." "Because I must," he replied, reaching for the plate with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "This is my punishment, isn't it? To consume the suffering I created until there is nothing left of who I was. To become what I never allowed my slaves to be, fully human." The food on the plate seemed to pulse with malevolent life as he brought it closer. The cornbread bled tears of molasses that looked suspiciously like blood. The coffee swirled with faces of torment. The honey-soaked biscuit in the center of the plate glowed with an inner light that hurt to look upon directly. "One last meal," Seraphina said, her voice now joined by the chorus of the dead. "One last taste of what you have sown." As Master Blackwood took his first bite, the transformation that had been building for months reached its climax. His remaining flesh seemed to melt away like wax in a fire, leaving behind only the essential core of his being, naked, vulnerable, stripped of all the privileges and protections that wealth and skin color had once provided. With each swallow, He experienced not just individual moments of suffering, but the entire system that had made such suffering possible. He felt the weight of laws that declared human beings to be property. He experienced the casual cruelty of a society that valued profit over people. He knew the particular horror of children born into bondage, their futures decided by the accident of their birth. But more than that, he finally understood the love that had motivated every act of resistance, every moment of defiance, every mother's desperate attempt to protect her children from the machinery of oppression. He felt Seraphina's love for Moses with an intensity that made his spirit cry out in recognition and regret. "I'm sorry," he gasped between bites, the words torn from what remained of his soul. "I'm so sorry. I would undo it all if I could. I would give anything to return your son to your arms. But you cannot," Seraphina replied, and now her voice carried the finality of death itself. "Moses grows up in chains because of your choices. He will never know his mother's touch, never hear the lullabies I sang to him, never feel safe in my embrace. That cannot be undone." As the last morsel passed his lips, Master Blackwood's transformation completed itself. His physical form dissolved entirely, leaving behind only a spirit that looked exactly like every slave who had ever worked his fields. Anonymous, interchangeable, reduced to the basic humanity that he had spent his life denying in others. "Now you know," Seraphina said, her task finally complete. "Now you understand what it means to be property, to be nothing more than a tool for another's profit. You will wander this plantation for eternity, experiencing every moment of suffering you ever caused, feeling every blow you ever ordered, shedding every tear your cruelty ever produced." The storm outside reached its peak as the curse found its final expression. Lightning struck the house again and again, but instead of destroying it, the electrical energy seemed to bind the supernatural forces more tightly to the physical structure. Magnolia Grove would become a prison for the guilty spirit of its former master, a place where justice could be served one agonizing moment at a time. But even as Thaddeus Blackwood's spirit was bound to eternal suffering, something unexpected happened. From the assembled ghosts of the enslaved came a sound that had rarely been heard in life, the sound of forgiveness. Not for the institution that had destroyed their lives, not for the system that had treated them as less than human, but for the individual soul who had finally, after death, learned to see them as they truly were. "Enough," said Rebecca, the woman who had died in childbirth.
"He understands now."
"The lesson is learned." "Let him rest," added Marcus, who had been whipped to death for trying to escape. "Justice has been served." One by one, the spirits of the dead began to fade, their anger finally spent, their need for vengeance satisfied. They had waited decades for this moment of recognition, and now that it had come, they could finally find peace. Only Seraphina remained, standing in the kitchen that had become the stage for this supernatural drama, but she too was changing, her form growing translucent as the completion of her task released her from the bonds that had held her to the world of the living. "Mama?" The voice was small, confused, impossibly dear. From the doorway of the kitchen stepped a figure that made Seraphina's dead heart leap with joy. She thought she would never feel again. It was Moses, not as he would be now growing up in slavery on a distant plantation, but as he had been when she last held him, 8 months old and perfect in every way. "My baby," she whispered, falling to her knees as he toddled toward her on unsteady legs. "My beautiful boy." As she gathered him into her arms, both mother and child began to glow with the same light that had once emanated from the cursed honey. But this was not the harsh illumination of vengeance, this was the gentle radiance of love finally reunited with its object. "The curse is broken," said Iya Agba, appearing one last time to witness her granddaughter's triumph. "Justice has been served and love has conquered death itself. Come, children, come home." As the storm finally began to subside, Seraphina rose to her feet with Moses in her arms and walked toward a doorway that had not existed moments before, a portal of light that led not to another room but to another realm entirely. Behind her, the kitchen returned to its mundane reality, empty of both the living and the dead. In the morning, the surviving slaves would find Magnolia Grove completely deserted of white inhabitants. Master Blackwood had vanished without a trace, and the plantation house stood empty and echoing, its rooms filled only with the memory of supernatural justice finally served. They would whisper among themselves that sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, They could hear the sound of chains dragging across the floors above. Not the chains of the enslaved, but the spiritual fetters that bound one guilty soul to an eternity of understanding what he had done. And on certain nights when the moon was dark and the wind was still, they claimed they could hear other sounds as well. The gentle laughter of a mother reunited with her child, the soft whisper of lullabies sung in a language older than sorrow, and the peaceful silence that comes when justice has finally, mercifully been served. The reckoning was complete, and Magnolia Grove would never be the same. 10 years had passed, since the night Magnolia Grove was transformed from a plantation into something far more terrible and sacred, a monument to justice served and mercy earned. The great house still stood, its white columns now permanently stained with rust-colored streaks that no amount of scrubbing could remove, but it no longer sheltered the living. Instead, it had become a way station for souls seeking understanding, a place where the dead could find peace and the guilty could find redemption through suffering. The former slaves had scattered to the four winds after emancipation came to Mississippi, but some had stayed, drawn by forces they couldn't fully comprehend. They had established a small community in the old slave quarters, transforming the cramped cabins into something approaching homes. Here they farmed the land that had once drunk their blood and sweat, but now they worked for themselves, their children, their future. Old Jeremiah had died peacefully in his sleep 5 years earlier, but his spirit lingered in the infirmary he had once tended, offering comfort to those who still needed healing. Magnolia, now ancient beyond her years, served as the community's unofficial historian, keeper of the stories that must never be forgotten. And Delilah had married a freeman from Natchez and borne 3 children who played in the very fields where their grandparents had labored in chains. But it was the big house that drew the most attention from those brave enough to approach it. Travelers on the river road would sometimes catch glimpses of lights moving through its empty rooms. Not the warm glow of oil lamps or candles, but the cold phosphorescence of spiritual energy. They spoke of hearing voices in languages they couldn't identify, of seeing figures that cast no shadows moving behind dust-covered windows. The locals had learned to give Magnolia Grove a wide berth after dark. Too many visitors had reported encounters that left them changed, their hearts heavy with the weight of understanding they hadn't asked for. A slave trader from Vicksburg had spent one night sheltering from a storm in the abandoned parlor, only to emerge the next morning weeping uncontrollably, his pocket full of bills of sale that he threw into the Mississippi River before walking away from his profession forever. A plantation owner from Georgia had laughed at the stories until he accepted a dare to spend a full night in the master bedroom. They found him 3 days later, sitting on the front steps with his hair turned completely white, speaking in the voices of the slaves he had worked to death, begging forgiveness from empty air. He freed every enslaved person on his property within the week, and used his fortune to establish schools for former slaves before disappearing into the Tennessee mountains, seeking a hermit's life of penance. But perhaps the most frequent visitor to Magnolia Grove was someone who had once been intimately connected to its darkest chapter. Dr. Jeremiah Pemberton arrived, every month without fail, his medical bag in hand, though he came not to practice medicine but to seek absolution. The baby Moses, now a young man of 10 years, traveled with him. Having been raised as Dr. Pemberton's own son after the physician experienced his own night of supernatural revelation, the boy knew the truth of his origins, knew about the mother who had died fighting for his freedom, and the justice she had claimed from beyond the grave. But there was no bitterness in him, only a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from some deeper source. He had his mother's dark eyes and quick intelligence, but there was something else, a serenity that spoke of souls reunited across the veil of death. "She visits me in dreams," he would tell Dr. Pemberton during their long carriage rides to the plantation. "Mama and the grandmother I never met. They sing to me in the old language and tell me stories about the homeland across the water. They're at peace now, both of them." On this particular November evening, exactly 10 years after the night of the final reckoning, their monthly pilgrimage carried special significance. The blood moon was rising again, and with it came power that made the boundary between worlds as thin as tissue paper. As their carriage approached the plantation gates, both man and boy could feel the spiritual energy that pulsed through the very air. The big house loomed before them in the crimson moonlight, its windows glowing with that familiar cold fire. But tonight was different. Tonight every window blazed with supernatural illumination, and the front door stood open in clear invitation. From within came the sound of voices, dozens of them speaking in a harmonious chorus. "Something's happening," Moses observed with the calm acceptance that had characterized his entire childhood. "Something final." Dr. Pemberton helped the boy down from the carriage, and together they approached the house that had become the center of their shared journey toward redemption. The voices grew clearer as they climbed the front steps, and Dr. Pemberton recognized the languages he had heard during his own night of spiritual education: Yoruba, Igbo, Kikongo, and others, the mother tongues of people stolen from their homelands and forced into bondage. But threading through the African languages were other voices speaking English, French, Spanish, the languages of those who had participated in or profited from the institution of slavery. These voices carried notes of recognition, understanding, and most surprisingly, forgiveness. The front hall was filled with figures both corporeal and spiritual, a gathering that defied every law of nature Dr. Pemberton thought he understood. Former slaves stood beside their former owners, Native Americans who had been enslaved alongside African captives, ship captains who had transported human cargo across the Middle Passage, traders who had built fortunes on human misery. All of them bore the marks of spiritual transformation, the humbled bearing of souls who had finally learned to see, past the artificial boundaries that had once divided them. At the center of this impossible assembly stood a figure that made both Dr. Pemberton and Moses catch their breath. It was Seraphina, but not as they had ever seen her in life. This was Seraphina transfigured, her form radiating the authority of one who had served justice and found peace. Beside her stood the spirit of her grandmother, Aya Agba, and behind them the ghostly forms of countless ancestors stretching back through generations. "Welcome," Seraphina said, her voice carrying across dimensions to reach their ears. "We have been waiting for you." As they moved deeper into the house, Dr. Pemberton realized that what he was witnessing was not merely a gathering, but a transformation of the entire plantation. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with healing energy, and rooms that had once echoed with the cries of the oppressed now resonated with something entirely different, the sound of understanding freely given and received. In the dining room, a feast had been laid out on the table that had once served meals prepared by enslaved hands for the benefit of their oppressors. But this was no ordinary meal. The food itself seemed to glow with inner light, and Dr. Pemberton understood instinctively that to partake would be to complete some spiritual circuit that had been years in the making. "This is the final feast," Seraphina explained as she gestured toward the table. "Not of vengeance, but of communion. For 10 years, this place has served as a school for souls who needed to learn the lesson of our shared humanity. Tonight, that education is complete." Around the table sat figures that represented every aspect of the slavery system: plantation owners who had learned empathy through experiencing their victims' pain, slave traders who had discovered the true cost of their commerce, politicians who had crafted laws that denied human dignity. But there were others as well. Abolitionists who had fought the system, former slaves who had found the strength to forgive, and ordinary people who had chosen compassion over complicity. At the head of the table, in the chair that had once belonged to Master Thaddeus Blackwood, sat a figure that bore his appearance but radiated an entirely different energy. This was what remained of the plantation owner after 10 years of experiencing every moment of suffering he had caused. Not the arrogant master who had sold a baby to pay gambling debts, but a soul who had been broken down and rebuilt in the image of true humanity. "I understand now," the figure said, his voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of a decade spent in spiritual bondage to his victims' experiences. "I understand what it means to be human, what it has always meant, regardless of the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth." Dr. Pemberton and Moses took their seats at the table, along with dozens of others whose spiritual education had brought them to this moment. As they did, Dr. Pemberton noticed that the food before them was somehow familiar. Cornbread that glowed with inner warmth, coffee that steamed with the promise of revelation, honey that carried the sweetness of justice fulfilled. "This is the same meal," he realized aloud. "The same food that began it all." "Yes," Seraphina confirmed, "but transformed by understanding. What once carried the bitterness of vengeance now holds the sweetness of reconciliation. What once bound souls to suffering now offers the promise of release." As the assembled company began to eat, something miraculous happened. With each bite, the artificial divisions that had separated them began to dissolve. The former master experienced not just his victims' pain, but their love, their hope, their unbreakable human dignity. The former slaves felt not just their oppressors' cruelty, but their capacity for growth, their potential for redemption, their essential humanity that had been buried beneath layers of cultural conditioning. Moses ate with the quiet acceptance that characterized everything he did. But Dr. Pemberton could see tears streaming down the young man's face, not tears of sorrow, but of recognition. This was the communion his mother had died to achieve, not through hatred, but through the transformative power of love that refused to be defeated even by death itself. As the meal progressed, the very structure of Magnolia Grove began to change. The walls grew brighter, the shadows softer. The stains on the columns outside began to fade, washed clean by spiritual rain that fell without touching the physical world. The plantation was being transformed, from a monument to human cruelty into something entirely different, a sanctuary where souls could come to learn the lessons that should have been taught in life. What happens now? Dr. Pemberton asked as the last morsel was consumed and the last cup drained. Now, Seraphina said, her form beginning to fade as her work in this world reached its completion. The school became a shrine, not to the horrors of the past, but to the possibility of redemption that exists in every human heart. Those who need to learn will be drawn here, and they will feast at this table until understanding comes. She turned to Moses, who had grown tall and strong in the care of the man who had once purchased him. And you, my beautiful boy, will carry our story into the world. You will tell them what happened here, not as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to love's power to transform even the darkest evil into something sacred. Moses nodded, his young face serious with the weight of his responsibility. I will remember, Mama. I will tell them about the woman who mixed her pain with food and served justice at every meal. But I will also tell them about forgiveness, and how love can survive even death itself. As he spoke these words, the spiritual energy that had sustained the gathering reached its crescendo. One by one, the figures around the table began to fade, their earthly business finally complete. Former slaves walked hand in hand with former masters toward a light that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world. The guilty found peace in understanding, and the innocent found rest in forgiveness granted. Dr. Pemberton watched in wonder as Seraphina approached the spirit of Master Blackwood, the man whose cruelty had set this entire supernatural drama in motion. For a moment they stood facing each other across the centuries of pain that separated the oppressor from the oppressed. Then, with infinite grace, Seraphina extended her hand. Come, she said simply. It's time to go home. The former master took her offered hand with the humility of someone who had finally learned what it meant to be truly human. Together they walked toward the light that had opened in the dining room wall. Not just the light of redemption, but of understanding so complete that all artificial divisions dissolved before it. As the supernatural assembly departed for whatever realm awaited souls at peace with themselves and each other, Magnolia Grove settled into its new purpose. The house still stood, but it was no longer a monument to human suffering. Instead, it had become something unprecedented in the history of the American South, a place where the sins of slavery could be confronted and, through genuine understanding and remorse, transformed into wisdom. Dr. Pemberton and Moses were the last to leave, walking hand in hand toward their carriage as the blood moon set behind the transformed plantation. As they reached the gates, the young man turned back one final time to look at the house where his mother had worked her supernatural justice. Goodbye, Mama, he said softly. Thank you for teaching them to see us as we really are. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of a woman's voice, singing a lullaby in a language older than sorrow. It was a sound of love triumphant, of justice served, and of a mother's devotion that had literally moved heaven and earth to secure her child's future. In the years that followed, Magnolia Grove would become a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand the true cost of America's original sin. Scholars would come to study the inexplicable phenomena that occurred within its walls. Former slaveholders would arrive broken and leave transformed. The children and grandchildren of slaves would visit to feel the presence of ancestors who had turned suffering into strength and hatred into healing. But perhaps most importantly, it became a place where the essential lesson of Seraphina's story could be learned by each new generation. that in the end, all human beings share the same capacity for both cruelty and compassion, and that love, even love born from the depths of unimaginable pain, has the power to transform even the most hardened hearts. The enslaved woman who had mixed menstrual blood into her master's meals had achieved something unprecedented in human history. She had not merely taken revenge, she had taken the very concept of revenge and transformed it into something sacred, turning the machinery of oppression into an instrument of ultimate justice and reconciliation. Moses would carry her story across the nation and beyond, telling audiences both black and white about the woman who had served justice at every meal and love at every table. Her legacy would live on not in the bitter taste of vengeance, but in the sweet promise that even in humanity's darkest moments, the possibility of redemption remains, and sometimes, on nights when the moon runs red and the veil between worlds grows thin, travelers passing by the old plantation claim they can still smell the scent of cornbread baking, coffee brewing, and honey warming on the stove, a final feast being prepared for souls still seeking the nourishment that only understanding can provide. The macabre curse had become something beautiful, and Magnolia Grove stood as eternal testament to the truth that love, once awakened to its own power, can transform even death into a doorway to deeper life. What did you think of this macabre tale? Subscribe for more horror stories and tell us in the comments which character's fate disturbed you most.